And now he's being told to practice child sacrifice, to put an end to the Jewish people, to put an end to his mission in life, to repudiate every promise that God had made him.
Welcome to Why Knowledge Matters. Rabbi Poupko, welcome. So great to have you back on the show.
My pleasure.
And first and foremost, obviously, how are you doing? So did you had a nice start into the new year?
Yeah, everything's good. Trying to manage life under some restrictions here in Quebec due to COVID, but otherwise okay.
Fantastic, because today, and this really also relates to COVID and the pandemic that we all face, we'll actually discuss Abraham's faith, which is pivotal, obviously, to the Jewish people and in particular to Judaism. Now, explain to us, what does Abraham's faith mean to the Jewish people in general and to Judaism in particular?
It's if you open up the Bible and you just read the story of Abraham, there is something missing in the story that we would really love to know. Because if you just read the Bible simply, one day God speaks to Abraham, tells him to leave his homeland, to leave his family, and to travel to the land which I will show you, in the words of the Bible. And God leads him to the land of Israel. When he arrives, God promises him that the land of Israel will be the possession of his children throughout history. And that's all we're told. And what I mean is, what's missing in the story is anything which would seem to qualify Abraham as being chosen by God for this mission, right? God brings him to Israel, tells him the land will be his, tells him that through him, all the families of mankind will be blessed, that he will be made great and have a great name, etc., etc. But before God speaks to him, there's no story in the Bible about Abraham. Now, after he's chosen, there were remarkable stories about Abraham, as everyone knows, how he intervenes to save his nephew Lot with great courage, how he's, the story with the binding of Isaac. There are the welcoming of guests. There are great stories about him after he's chosen. But nothing in the Bible is told to us about Abraham before he's chosen. What qualifies Abraham for this? So his future life certainly vindicates the choice, but you would imagine that in this foundational moment of the Bible, where the first Jew is spoken to and given this mission in life, that you know something about him before he's chosen. For instance, if you compare it to the story of Moses, right? Before Moses is spoken to by God at the burning bush, we're told remarkable stories about him. That even though he's living in the palace and can choose to stay there in the comfort and security of the palace, he chooses to leave the palace and to seek out his brothers. And the first day he intercedes to save a Jew who's being beaten by the Egyptian taskmaster. The next day he tries to bring peace between Jews. The next story is he tries to save a Midianite woman who's being assaulted at a well. He saved Zipporah. So at least the Bible goes to some, to some length to explain to us why Moses, of all people, was chosen to lead the Jewish people. And God God chooses to appoint and anoint him, and he speaks to him at the burning bush. But that's a great contrast to Abraham, because before God speaks to Abraham, there's not a single story about him in the Bible. So what qualifies him for this? So, and then you have to ask the question, no matter what you conjure up as an answer to that question, why didn't the Bible tell us anything about him before he was chosen? Why was it left out? So I mean, and that presents, obviously some problems. So I'm not telling you I have every answer to every question here, but the absence of a backstory, the absence of a CV for Abraham before he's chosen, is really quite interesting. Now, so here's the problem we have as Jews. It's not a problem, we have a solution, because we have, thank God, 3,300 years of rabbinic literature and other literature that fills in the gaps. So the rabbis ask in the Midrash, right? What was going on with Abraham before this? Like, what was going on? And there is an allusion later on in the prophets about Abraham being saved from a fiery furnace. So the rabbis fill in the blanks there. And this is, again, after the first 5 books of the Bible. This is much later in the Bible. And Meor Kasdim, from the fires of Kasdim, he was saved. That he was, in fact, a rebel against paganism. That's what Abraham, in other words, let me explain what I mean. You walk in the streets of Winnipeg or Toronto or Montreal, and you ask a normal person, who are the Jews? And what will they say? They'll say, oh, those are the guys that aren't Christians, right? You walk in the streets of Morocco and you ask a normal person, who are the Jews? You'll say, oh, those are the people who aren't Muslims. Both those answers are terribly false. We aren't not Christian. We aren't not Muslim. We are not pagan, right? Because Judaism grew up as a civilization in opposition and in contrast to paganism, right? Judaism predates the other monotheistic religions by significant chunks of time. So who aren't we? And that's important. I mean, if you're a Montrealer, you understand this because every identity has a positive and negative connotation. If you're a fan of the Montreal Canadiens, part of that is being anti the Toronto Maple Leafs. That's part of your identity. So Jews are not the anti or non-Christians. Jews are not the anti or non-Muslims. We are the anti-pagans. That's who we are, essentially. So when Abraham, rises to leadership and prominence, it's in opposition to paganism. Now, but again, so that's one part of the story. He was, according to the rabbinic embellishment of the prophetic allusion later in the Bible, that Abraham was persecuted for his rejection of the dominant thinking, and that he was threatened with death and thrown into a furnace, and God miraculously saved him, right? Building on those sentences later in Nehemiah. Okay, but the rabbis also fill in blanks otherwise. They ask, how did Abraham come to believe? How did he come to believe? So what's interesting is the rabbis in the 4th and 5th and 6th century come up with arguments that are only heard later in the world of philosophy, I believe in the 19th century, in the school of empiricism, which is, Abraham's walking through the forest one day, he sees a house, and he sees and he wonders. He says, who's the master of the house? And then he says to himself, if I see a house and I assume it has a builder and a master, why is it that when I look in the world, don't I understand the same thing? In other words, the argument from design, right? Every table has a carpenter, every shoe has a shoemaker, right? So that's the argument for the belief in God, that our experience tells us that everything has a creator. So that's the argument for the belief in God that the rabbis put in the mouth of Abraham. Again, that's the rabbinic understanding of how someone might come to believe in God. Again, this isn't in the Bible itself. This is rabbinic writing centuries and centuries later. And when the rabbis write in the Midrash and they wonder how Abraham comes to faith, they're not really asking about Abraham because they have no way of knowing. What they're asking really is, how does anybody come to faith? What is an argument for faith? So they put it in the mouth of Abraham. So what does Abraham believe that's so radically different? What does he believe that's so radically different? Also, we know there are people in the Bible before Abraham who certainly believed in God. Adam believes in God, Noah believes in God, yet they're not chosen to be the first Jew. Abraham is. So what was lacking in Adam? What was lacking in Noah? What distinguishes Abraham not only from everyone else in his world, but from the people mentioned earlier in the Bible who clearly believed in God. So it's clear that belief alone is insufficient. It's insufficient to be selected as the first Jew. It's Abraham who's selected as the first Jew, not Noah. So why? And the answer really is that, is one fundamental thing, is that Abraham was the first one. And this is proven throughout his life, how he engages the people around him. He was the first one to understand the logical and ethical consequences of faith. What I mean by that is, by rejecting paganism and asserting monotheism, by rejecting the idea of multiple gods and asserting there is one God, by rejecting the idea of a physical God and asserting the existence of a spiritual God, Abraham not only changes how we think about God, more importantly, or at least as importantly, he changes how we look at each other as human beings. Because in the world of the pagan, your God is not my God. The story of your origin is not the story of my origin. We share nothing in common. And with the assertion of monotheism, not only is there one God, there's one human race, and we're all connected to each other. The idea that human beings constitute one human race is the exclusive consequence of monotheism. It comes from no other place. So when you turn on the internet and you see the story of somebody suffering in a foreign land who doesn't look like you, talk like you, worship like you, but you feel a basic empathetic impulse, that's only because you're the child of a monotheistic culture. You're a child of a culture built by Judaism and later Christianity and later Islam, which taught the world there's one human race because there's one God. And because there's one God, there's one human race. And that's so, as my late father always used to put it, we're not monotheists, we're ethical monotheists. Monotheism has to radically change how you look at other people. And as wonderful as Adam and Noah may have been about their faith in God, they didn't get it. They didn't understand that because you believe in God, that means when you look at anybody else in the world, you're seeing somebody who shares your common humanity. So I would argue that even the most strident atheist in 2022 has that humanity, that basic sense of universalism, only because they are the descendants of the monotheistic culture, which were the only ones who introduced that idea, that there's one human race, if there's only one God. And that's what's so important about Abraham. He understood the ethical consequences of belief. Now, I would also concede another point, that there's a negative consequence to this. No, there are no good ideas in this world that don't have negative consequences. There are no purely good ideas, right? So the negative consequence is that if monotheism ushers in the notion of one human race, it also ushers in the idea, the very dangerous idea, that we all have to practice the same way. So those who propagated in the past that unless you do it my way, you will be denied God's salvation. And if God doesn't love you, I don't have to love you, which creates the misery that we've seen too often emanating from religion. That's the downside of monotheism. The downside of monotheism is if there's one human race, that means conformity. If there's one human race, that means there's only one way to do it. And that's a possible dangerous consequence, which we've seen in history and in some places continue to see. But fundamentally, the faith of Abraham is a faith that speaks to us not only about how we conceive of God as being one, secondly, as being spiritual, but it also directly affects how we look at each other.
And what do you make of the story where Abraham walks up to the mountain who was basically willing to sacrifice his only son, Isaac? I mean, this is, to me, was it to somehow a test by God in order to test Abraham's faith? Or what do you make of this story, which is really, really profound?
I'll tell you, I've been teaching the story, my entire adult life. And had you asked me the question 30 years ago or 20 years ago or 10 years ago, I would have given you an answer. And that's the beauty of biblical study. We read the same story. Actually, we read this story twice a year. We read it as part of the normal flow of the Bible, where we read it, but we also read it on the Jewish New Year. We read it on Rosh Hashanah, and it becomes the basic text, really, of Rosh Hashanah, of the Jewish New Year. It becomes the paradigm of Jewish martyrdom, right? If you read Jewish literature, we talk about the binding of Isaac, even though no one died. No one died. Isaac lives. We talk about it as setting the precedent to be willing to die for faith, and to give up everything for faith, and that there are things worth living for and worth dying for. And it is it's an incredible story, and in some levels a troubling story. I remember as a kid, the first time I studied it when I was, 7 or 8, and I came home that night and I looked at my father and I said, and you wonder to yourself, when you've done that, I know, I'm sure today when they study it, they bring in teams of social workers. Anyway, so it's a fascinating story. So on one level, the most simple understanding, when I say simple, I don't mean not sophisticated. I mean simple in the sense that if you follow just the narrative, it's a story of faith. And I don't think we really understand what a deep challenge this was, because he had been promised his whole life that he would have but one heir. And he goes childless for many years. And at one time he suggests maybe Eliezer, his aide, will be his successor. Maybe Yishmael will be his successor. And God keeps saying, no, you're going to have a child with Sarah. That child's going to be the next Jew to carry on this mission. And that's it. Only Isaac. Ki bi Yitzchak yikar l'chazara. Only with Isaac will you have a descendant. Okay. He's told all along that his children are going to populate the land of Israel, that they're going to be a blessing to the entire world, that exclusively through him and through his children, will the world know about God. Right? This is what he's been told his entire life. He's also spent his entire life fighting paganism, which practiced child sacrifice. So here God comes to him and tells him, kill your child, kill the future of the Jewish people. Everything I told you about the future of history is now gone. It's no more Isaac, no more Jewish people, nothing. No more land of Israel, nothing. All the pagans who you scorned for engaging in child sacrifice, now you're going to do that. I mean, it's the most bizarre request. It's a repudiation of everything he had been told and everything he believed in and everything he fought for. And now he's being told to practice child sacrifice, to put an end to the Jewish people, to put an end to his mission in life, to repudiate every promise that God had made him. And yet he does it. So, as Kierkegaard put it, he said, a man of God doesn't do what's rational, he does what he's told. So that's certainly a compelling understanding of the story. I would argue, however, that there's possibly other interpretations of the story. Possibly. And anyone who talks about this should do so with actual humility, not pretend humility. Everything I'm going to say to you, I say with profound humility, because I don't know. But there's another possible interpretation of the story. If you remember the chapter, how it begins, and God tested Abraham. So if you're a reader of the Bible and you get to chapter 21 in Genesis, and it says, or whatever, and he's 22, he says to him, God tested Abraham. So what do you know already? You know it's not going to happen. It's only a test. So there's no suspense when you read the story, right? Because you know it's only a test. You know, when I was young, they used to have tests on TV to prepare for nuclear war with the Russians, and there'd be a special screen on your TV, and it would say, the normal program would end. It says, "This is a test. It's only a test of the emergency broadcast system," right? You knew it's a test. Nobody was bombing you, right? It's a test. Next thing we're told, and this is not, none of this is conclusive. Abraham travels to Mount Moriah with Isaac, and with two others that are with him. And he says to the two other people with him, he says, myself and Isaac, we're going to the mountain. We're going to serve God there, and then we will return to you. So is that a proof? Not really. On the one hand, it seems that he knows that Isaac will survive. But on the other hand, what was the alternative? He was going to say, I'm going to go kill my kid. I'll be back without him. So it's hard to know. But he does say, we will return. Nelchav and Ashuva. We will go and we will return. We will come back. So was this just a charade, a drama for Abraham to publicly reject child sacrifice? In other words, to go up there, to tie his son to the altar, to lift the knife and say, no, we don't do this. God chooses life. God chooses life. Maybe that's one interpretation. Maybe a more radical interpretation is that if you read the story of Abraham up until now, what do you expect Abraham's response to be to God when he's told to kill his son? If you read the story of Abraham till this point, you don't expect Abraham to behave the way he behaved. Just a couple of chapters earlier, what happens? God comes to Abraham and says to Abraham, God says to himself, how can I conceal from Abraham that which I'm going to do? I have to tell him what I'm going to do because I know that he will raise his children to do justice and mercy, right? That's what God says. I have to tell Abraham because Abraham is my partner, right? Abraham is the first Jew, is a partner with God in trying to make the world a better place. And he says, therefore, God says to himself, and it's in the Bible, I have to tell Abraham what I'm going to do. And he comes to Abraham and he says, I'm going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because they're wicked. What does Abraham say? Does he say, okay, I'll leave it up to you? No. He engages in a lengthy debate with God. He argues with God. He says to God, you can't do this. There must be some innocence in those cities. He says to him in Hebrew, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. How can the judge of the world not do justice? He speaks with a way that none of us would speak to God. He yells at God. He says, can the judge of the world not do justice? There must be innocence there. And it goes on. Maybe there's 50 righteous, 45, 40, 30, 20. It goes on, but he doesn't give up. He does it unrelentingly. He fights with God. He says, you have to save these cities. Right? By the way, that's the first prayer in the Bible. The first prayer is a Jew arguing with God, demanding justice for this world. So you expect a couple of chapters later when he comes and he tells him to kill his son, he would maybe object with the 1% of the fervor that he dedicated to his defense of Sodom and Gomorrah, but not a word, not a word, not a word. How does he defend Sodom and Gomorrah, not his own child? Right? He's not shy. Faith is not portrayed here as subservience. Faith here is portrayed as partnership. Faith isn't accepting. That's what's so far in the Bible, right? Abraham rejects initially the plan of God for Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Faith doesn't mean you just salute, right? Faith means you have a right to argue with God and demand justice. So he's told to kill his child. Why doesn't he do anything? So probably the most logical answer to that question is, When God tells you what he's going to do to somebody else, you fight for them. When God gives you a direct order, you can't argue. Okay, that is a very good answer to the question. That's a sufficient answer. But maybe there's another answer to the question. Maybe just like God was testing Abraham, Abraham was testing God. And let me tell you what I mean by that, without sounding heretical. God comes to Abraham, and he says to Abraham, kill your child. And what maybe Abraham understands a little bit about what the future might hold for his children. And he says to God, he says, yeah, I know what you want. He says to himself, you want me to argue with you again? You want me to try to save my son? He says, no, God, you're going to have to do it yourself. Abraham says, enough already. I did so much. And you go through the stories, you'll know what I mean, how he suffered with, with Sarah, and the story with, all the stories he went through. And he says, I know what you want from me. I know exactly what you want. You expect me to argue for my son's life. And he says to God, no, God, I've done enough. my quote is full. I've done enough for you, God. Now you got to do for me. You have to save the child. You have to save the child. And he puts his kid on the donkey. He knows his son's going to live, but he wants to put it down in black and white. And there are going to be times when the partnership balance shifts to God, where God has to be the one to do it. And he says to God, I'm going to lift up the knife, but you got to stop me because I can't do this myself anymore. There are times in history where we turn to God and we say, you've empowered us. You've given us gifts of wisdom and courage to make the world better. But there are going to be times, Abraham says to God, where we can't do it. We're going to be a little too old and a little too tired. We will have gone through enough. And we turn to you, God, you have to do it. You have to say, do not cast your hand to the child. Let the child live. So, that's a radical interpretation. And I'm not saying that anyone should accept it. But if you read, the text of the Bible closely, it's clear that Abraham's quick acquiescence to the command represents a departure from how he's behaved beforehand.
What does Abraham's faith mean for today's world we live in?
Listen, I think, we Jews, we take faith for granted. It's not a question of do you believe or not believe. The question is, now that you believe, what are you going to do? So, and when I say we take it for granted, it's not because we minimize it, but we believe it's so obvious that we don't have to struggle with it. How else do you explain my existence here in this world without faith, without the absolute certainty that there is a God in the world? We believe in God with greater certainty than we believe in the force of gravity. We take that for granted. We know that. And if you need any proof, the story of the Jewish people is the greatest living proof of God. But the question is, what do you do with faith? And like Abraham, the first essential step in faith is to live a life of absolute commitment to compassion and to kindness and to justice. That's what it means. It means to be a child of Abraham. To be a legitimate child of Abraham is to lead a life of humility and charity. That's what it means to be a child of Abraham. Do what you can to alleviate the pain of others.
Rabbi, it's always a pleasure to listen to your inspiring words. Once again, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure, honestly.
Rabbi Reuben Poupko.